Hello, this is Karasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we will be talking about the initial preview of the Sand Lane hero class, since the War Within Alpha will soon be upon us. Sand Lane's core mechanic is Vampiric Strike, a proc effect that can occur off of Heart Strike. Presumably, this will function exactly like a normal Heart Strike, except with some special bonuses attached. The first of these bonuses is a 3% maximum life healing effect, which is very similar to one of our talents, Leeching Strike. Like the talent Leeching Strike, this effect does next to nothing for us for our overall healing. It is a trivial amount of healing relative to what Death Strike is already generating, so just like the talent, we don't particularly care about this effect. Instead, what we are really interested in is Essence of the Blood Queen, which can provide us with a stacking 1.5% haste buff per stack for 20 seconds. This is not a buff with normal stacking, however, so I'm going to take a quick tangent to talk about different stacking mechanics and how people refer to them. With normal stacking, every additional buff stack you gain would refresh the duration of all stacks, and they all use a shared timer. So if we have a 10-second stacking buff that refreshes 5 seconds in, both stacks that we now have would last until 15 seconds. If you hear people talking about Iron Fur stacking, they're talking about a situation where each stack has its own independent duration, where the second stack functions independently of the first one. So this would change the first example situation to one where you only have one stack between 10 and 15 seconds, because your first stack has expired at 10 seconds since it was applied initially, and your second stack still lasts the full 10 seconds from 5 seconds to 15. Finally, we have Festermight Stacking, where new stacks do not refresh a shared duration that is being used between all stacks. It is generally the type of stacking that provides the worst amount of value relative to the others, and that also happens to be the type of stacking that is being used for Essence of the Blood Queen. Given Festermight Stacking, the value of this talent should be very concerning, because a 10% chance to gain a Vampiric Strike proc on a Death Strike is not something that is going to happen very frequently in comparison to a 20-second buff duration. But that's where the capstone talent comes in, Gift of the Sand Lane, which makes 100% of our heart strikes during Vampiric Blood Vampiric Strike. This is going to be where the vast majority of our Vampiric Strikes are coming from, and that also allows us to reach a decent stack count on Essence of the Blood Queen before it expires. That being said, if you are familiar with the gameplay implications of Festermight Stacking, you might be considering that you need to specifically time your Vampiric Blood casts in order to get the best value out of the resulting Essence of the Blood Queen stacks. In general, Festermight Stacking means that your stack generation at high remaining buff duration is going to be a lot more valuable than any stack generation at low remaining durations, which incentivizes you to change your gameplay to this to some extent. But don't worry, Blizzard is aware of this incentive issue, and they are not a big fan of players holding their major cooldowns to get more value out of them in this fashion. As such, they revealed in an interview that they are making an exception to normal Festermight stacking rules by allowing both Vampiric Blood and Dark Transformation for Unholy to refresh the buff duration on Essence of the Blood Queen when cast. So now, it should always feel good to press these cooldowns. Problem solved, right? Surely this doesn't cause anything unintentional to happen, like, I don't know, being able to endlessly refresh the duration of Essence of the Blood Queen while never losing any stacks at all. For you see, the baseline buff duration of 20 seconds can be further extended through Insight Terror, another hero talent, which gives us bonus duration with every heart strike. Double the duration when you're specifically proccing Vampiric Strike. On the flip side, Red Thirst is already capable of lowering Vampiric Blood below a 30-second cooldown in the current state of the game. Toss in an extra haste buff and extra rune regeneration from the Sand Lane hero class itself, and as long as you are maintaining good melee uptime, you can be left with a situation where your Vampiric Blood cooldown is less than your Essence of the Blood Queen buff duration. So now, the fun begins. With max stacks of Essence of the Blood Queen all the time, and 2 additional stacks from Frenzied Bloodthirst, we get 10.5% haste from the buff effect baseline. However, because of Gift of the Sand Lane, we will get double that effect when Vampiric Blood is active. And when running this hero talents with our regular Vampiric Blood talents, our uptime on Vampiric Blood is greater than 50%, giving us an average haste benefit of around 16%. Frenzied Bloodthirst also provides 5% increased Death Strike damage on Essence of the Blood Queen per stack, which presumably also gets doubled in effectiveness from Vampiric Blood due to Gift of the Sand Lane, for let's say an average of 53% increased damage on Death Strike. Similarly, we gain enough of a rune refund rate on Heartstrike to potentially cast 50% more Heartstrikes than usual. Those are all benefits tied to Essence of the Blood Queen, and they make up about half the hero talent tree for Sand Lane. The only cost required to get these full benefits is that you need to use Vampiric Blood on cooldown. That being said, the next talent we are talking about is also very important, even if it isn't directly tied to Essence of the Blood Queen. Infliction of Sorrow makes your Vampiric Strike deal damage based on your remaining Blood Plague duration. Outside of Vampiric Blood, it deals a larger portion of damage and consumes Blood Plague completely, while inside Vampiric Blood, it deals less damage and extends Vampiric Blood. The damage difference is mostly equalized by the proc rates you will have both inside and outside Vampiric Blood on Vampiric Strike. Just to get an idea of how much damage this is doing, let us look at the Vampiric Blood version of the proc and see how much damage this proc does relative to a regular Heartstrike. For this example, we are going to assume normal Mythic Plus talents, so no improved Heartstrike. Heartstrike normally does 47.5% of attack power and physical damage, while Blood Plague normally does 83.28% of attack power over its full duration, with Infliction of Sorrow dealing 20% of that in damage on a proc. If we factor in 30% physical damage reduction from enemy armor on the Heartstrike damage and assume 4 stacks of Coagulopathy for Blood Plague, then we are looking at a situation where Infliction of Sorrow is more than doubling Heartstrike damage. And given how often we are in Vampiric Blood and how much we are Heartstriking from all of the haste and rune regeneration, 24 seconds on Blood Plague isn't even an unreasonable assumption for average duration, especially since you can extend Blood Plague all the way up to a maximum of 31 seconds of duration, which is 30% more than the base duration. Because of Infliction of Sorrow and the extra rune regeneration, we are only really using Blood Boil to reapply Blood Plague if it falls off, which, because of the extension, it won't really fall off unless you're fighting more than 5 targets, or if you get an out of Vampiric Blood Infliction of Sorrow proc. And Vampiric Strikes out of Vampiric Blood are not very frequent with their 10 to 15% proc rate on Death Strike. There is a small chance Blood Boil is used to keep Blood Plague duration above a threshold duration to increase the average proc damage on Infliction of Sorrow, and that this is worth doing. But there's a reasonable chance that this might not be a damage gain. However, it will be hard to verify this for sure before a Simcraft module is set up to model this in more detail. As for the rest of the talents, they are not looking nearly as impactful, so they won't need nearly the same level of discussion. The Blood is Life seems to spawn something similar to Bloodworms, though we don't have enough information to say exactly how much damage they will be doing. A choice node will also be available to turn these Blood Beasts into a shadow damage amplifier of some sort, but again, we don't know how often they spawn or their damage or how this damage even splits from the stored up shadow damage, so it's hard to say how influential this will be at the end of the day. Otherwise, we can take another talent on this choice node that gives us a small overall damage and runic power generation increase that is concentrated during the execution phase, when the enemy has less than 35% health. Not much else to say here without knowing the exact details on the Blood Beasts, however. The next choice node on the left gives a choice of utility benefits. Normally only druids can revive people at full health in combat, but the first option in this choice node gives us the ability to do that as well, along with a shield effect that is on us that gives us some compensation for when we burn both a global cooldown and runic power on resurrecting a teammate. The movement speed option isn't completely terrible, but I have a hard time seeing it as much of a game changer in any case. So, given the minor effectiveness of both of these talents on this choice node, it's hard to say which one's better, but some nice perks nonetheless. The final choice node gives upgrades for our defensive cooldowns. The first option gives Lichborn a group leech buff in addition to passive leech. This group leech buff is much weaker than the vampiric aura that we saw back in Legion. I doubt it will even be too effective of a healing cooldown with only 6% leech every 2 minutes. The passive leech also does basically nothing for us personally. The Icebound Fortitude option has a lot more potential. Icebound Fortitude in general has a much lower uptime than Vampiric Blood and the Dancing Rune weapon, and it's also weaker at mitigating damage while it is active than those other two cooldowns. But this upgrade provides a pretty significant boost to the actual effectiveness of Icebound Fortitude while it is active. And assuming you don't need the Killing Blow to get the cooldown reduction effect, that cooldown reduction will also be reasonably significant as long as you're fighting trash in Mythic Plus. So in general, I do think the second option looks like a nice perk to have, and probably better than the Lichborn effect if we're going to be completely honest. Lastly, we have the Death and Decay talent. The proc rate of Vampiric Strike outside of Vampiric Blood is so low to the point where it isn't overly impactful, and the 5% increase we're getting here while standing in Death and Decay isn't really going to change that situation much in a significant way. So the only real benefit we're interested in here is the 5% physical damage reduction while inside Death and Decay. It's nothing crazy, and we won't have this benefit all the time, but we'll take it. It's not a bad thing to have. That being said, this is the 5th talent for Blood Death Knights that gives a bonus to standing in Death and Decay, and I know there are plenty of people out there who are not a huge fan of that dynamic, at least in Mythic Plus. So let us quickly review all of the benefits as a whole for Sand Lane. We are being given a 16% haste multiplier. Our death strikes do roughly 50% more damage than usual. Our heart strikes do roughly twice as much damage as usual with a shatter damage proc. We have more runes than we can spend under more normal circumstances. And because of these runes, we use minimal blood boil just for blood plague maintenance. We cast Vampiric Blood on cooldown, which is a price we need to pay to keep all of these other benefits so high. We have 5% physical damage reduction while standing in Death and Decay, and we get Blood Beast spawns for an ambiguous amount of extra damage. We also have 2 choice nodes that provide upgrade options to some of our utility and defensive abilities. There are a few things to note here. First, because we are emphasizing Heart Strike so much over Blood Boil in this hero talent tree, practically all of the damage benefits associated with Sand Lane only affect up to 5 targets. In fact, we are doing less damage to the 6th target and beyond than what we will be doing without this hero class, because we will be blood boiling less while all other sources of uncapped AoE damage do not scale with haste benefits or get any of these damage increase benefits. That being said, we will be doing significantly more damage than before to those first 5 targets, mostly from the haste, the increased death strike damage, and the increased hard strike damage. Moving on, forced downtime can cause us to lose our stacks, which will temporarily reduce benefits until we can ramp up our stacks again. However, with such a low cooldown on Vampiric Blood, you shouldn't need to wait too long until you can revive your 7 stack. The talent tree implications are not anything too profound. The high emphasis on Vampiric Blood would just strongly incentivize both Red Thirst and improved Vampiric Blood. We were already using these talents in Mythic Plus, though in Raid it was very rare for us to use 2 out of 2 Red Thirst, and we practically never ran improved Vampiric Blood in Raid. So, in a sense, Sand Lane, Raid, and Mythic Plus talent builds would have less variation than they do now and look a little more uniform. And since a larger proportion of our damage would be haste scaling as Sand Lane, we would expect haste to gain some amount of relative value as a secondary stat compared to the other secondary stats, at least compared to the baseline blood specialization. This would be especially true if they removed the 100% uptime gameplay dynamic that we have now with Sandlane, since higher haste in those situations would result in higher stack counts and higher benefits. So, at its core, Sandlane places an extremely high emphasis on Heartstrike, Deathstrike, Vampiric Blood, and Haste with its buff extending gameplay, along with a handful of other minor perks. That being said, this would certainly change Blood Death Knight's normal gameplay by making us use Vampiric Blood on cooldown and causing us to lean more heavily on Heartstrike than usual. Given its short cooldown, spamming Vampiric Blood might not be the worst thing in the world, but it does make things incredibly awkward when you need to sit on cooldowns to survive specific tank buster mechanics. Granted, this does not look like something that remains in its current state and power for too long. It may already have seen major changes by the time Alpha launches. This thing looks like it has the potential to increase damage output up to 5 targets by around 50%, which just seems uncomfortably large from a Blizzard perspective, while the survivability benefits of the extra resource regeneration from 16% haste are also very significant. On that note, the overall resource regeneration for Blood Death Knights is a bit out of control with this hero class if it wasn't already out of control in Dragonflight. With this much Deathstrike mitigation, it is difficult to kill Blood Death Knights unless you make them take oppressive amounts of burst damage, which just makes the specialization incredibly hard to tune correctly from a designer standpoint. But I digress. If we are judging hero classes by their ability to alter and enhance normal specialization dynamics, then I think it is fair to say that Sandlane succeeds at this. It just does so in ways that might not be great for the long-term health of the blood specialization, at least in a few aspects that I've already talked about, such as the excess resource regeneration, making us use Vampiric Blood on cooldown, and tying us more strongly to death and decay. We'll need to see what changes Blizzard has made to this hero class in the meantime, since the original talent preview, once the first alpha build is released. In any case, let me know what your thoughts are on the Sandlane hero class in the comments below. And if there is anything in particular you would like to see changed, or anything you think is especially problematic. As always, feel free to stop by the channel Discord if you want to talk about Blood Death Knight theory crafting, general Mythic Plus questions, or if you would like a Mythic Plus log review. The channel Discord information, as well as my personal Discord contact information, is in the video description below. And if you want to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote the video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.